Well, first, there's the Xena cam. She's sleeping in her bed on the window bench. Xena! Xena, you sleep? Good girl. Go back to sleep. It's good. Go back to sleep. Xena. Okay, so now we are going to be doing the rest of March, which was the next chapter. I'm on the window bench myself, and it's chilly because it's been snowing out. But this was a really interesting chapter. I think it's my favorite chapter so far, where you're really starting to, the primaries are heating up, the drama is heating up, and I'm starting to really, like, feel it. So actually the title was Later in March. And some of the interesting subtitles are The Banshee Screams in Florida. Hube slithers, that's a word we don't use nearly enough, out of obscurity, and Fear and Loathing on the Democratic left. I thought the Democrats were left, but I guess there's the left of the left. I wonder if there's ever been a book called What's Left of the Left. It has multiple meanings. Okay, so again, they're heading into primary season and the New Hampshire primary, so the very first primary. And they were flying to Florida after the New Hampshire primary. And what I thought was really interesting here is he's talking about flying into Miami International Airport. And again, this was written in the 70s, so not like airports today, but he was traveling with McGovern's campaign manager, Frank Mankiewicz, I think is how you pronounce it. And like the plane had a really rough landing, but this dude was just like sleeping through it. And then the minute he woke up, he's like, oh, I got to prepare for a speech. Oh, I got to meet with Shirley MacLaine. Like he was just like sleep energy. And it kind of reminded me of me in a way. But when they landed, Mankiewicz, or however you pronounce that, I'm just going to call him Manky, needed to start arranging all this, so he like planted himself in front of a payphone. You know, I don't even think there are payphones in the airport at all anymore, with a handful of dimes, not even quarters, dimes, and a small notebook. And Hunter here says, I was impressed by this show of efficiency. Here was the one-man organizing vortex, main theorist, and central intelligence behind the McGovern for President campaign. A small, rumpled little man who looked like an out-of-work, pre-owned car salesman, putting McGovern's Florida primary action together from a public wall phone in the Miami airport. And he talked about the various titles that Menke has had. He was press secretary, he's campaign manager, now he's presently political director, but all in all, he's the man behind the man. And that is what call him what you want, who ends up being your campaign managers really are. And apparently he was a political columnist for the Washington Post before he quit to do this gig with McGovern. And he was predicting, leading up to the New Hampshire primary, that McGovern would get 38%. And everyone thought he was absolutely nuts. And then when the totals came in, McGovern had 37.5%. And people just all of a sudden started thinking he was a political genius. And Ed Muskie, who was supposed to sweep with well over a majority, ended up with only 46%, which was the beginning of the end for him. But here, the rumpled little man, a photo of Menke. Okie dokie. So, Menke had predicted, and this is how things went. Menke said, Muskie is already finished. He had no base. Nobody's really for Muskie. They're only for the front runner, the man who says he's the only one who can beat Nixon. But not even Muskie himself believes that anymore. He couldn't even win a majority of the Democratic vote in New Hampshire on his own turf. So it was like there was no good candidates, or any of the good candidates no one thought could beat Nixon. So a lot of the Democrat bigwigs and the big brains were saying you had to get behind Muskie because he was the only one who could beat Nixon, even if you had to hold your nose to do it. But then the Florida primary came after the big upset in New Hampshire, and Muskie only got 9% in Florida, and it was the end. Wisconsin was next, but it was already the end. And apparently he went off the rails. And considering it was done on this like whistle-stop train tour, I guess pun intended. And it's funny, Hunter describes this whole campaign thing as the saga of downers and treachery, called the campaign trail. And he described Wisconsin. He said, dull speeches for breakfast, duller speeches for lunch, then bullshit with gravy for dinner. And he said, the only possible good that can come out of this wretched campaign is the ever-increasing likelihood that it will cause the Democratic Party to self-destruct. A lot of people are seriously worried about this, but I'm not one of them. I've never been much of a party man myself. And the more I learn about the realities of national politics, the more I am convinced that the Democratic Party is an atavistic endeavor, more an obstacle than a vehicle. That is, there's really no hope of accomplishing anything genuinely new or different in American politics until the Democratic Party is done away with. Things never change, do they? It's always one party or another is dying and needs to go. And he was starting, though, you can see throughout this chapter, he's really starting to have a grudging admiration for McGovern. Not because he was a politician, but despite it, because he wasn't a typical politician. And he said, after watching McGovern perform in 2 primaries, I think he should stay in the Senate, where his painfully earnest style is not only more appreciated, but also more effective. And he was contrasting McGovern and Muskie and said, Muskie doesn't come off well on TV, but in person, you really grow to respect the man, that he's genuinely likable. Meanwhile, Muskie is just a dick in person and maybe can give a good impression on TV or in a crowded auditorium giving a speech. And who won Florida was Wallace. And that is interesting. And Hunter says, I think quite clearly, like it was very clearly, it's not the right word, obviously he's a clear writer, but I mean like he nailed it. When he says the main problem in any democracy is that crowd pleasers are generally brainless swine who can go out on a stage and whip up their supporters into an orgiastic frenzy and then go back to the office and sell every one of the poor bastards down the tube for a nickel apiece. Isn't that's so true? And I guess he was saying McGovern's biggest fault was that he had such a dry sense of humor that people called it withered. And Muskie's staff, he describes it, none of them even believed in Muskie, but they're working for him, particularly the younger people, because he's the only Democrat that could beat Nixon, allegedly. But when he lost in Florida, people were really starting to reconsider that. And at that point, the Muskie campaign decided that he would stop being a middle-of-the-road centrist and start pandering to the left of the Democratic Party, the Democratic left. And this is where Muskie started going off the rails. He got on TV and denounced George Wallace on network TV as a demagogue of the worst sort and a threat to the country's underlying values of humanism, of decency, of progress. And then the rhetoric started coming out of the Muskie campaign. We're going to erase that yellow stripe in the middle of the road. I guess they're saying they were cowardly before and now they are not going to be. And he sums it up here. As late as February 15th, remember this chapter now is in March, Ed Muskie was generally conceded, even by his political opponents, to be within an eyelash or two of having the Democratic nomination so skillfully locked up that the primaries wouldn't even be necessary. He had the public endorsements of almost every capital B, big, capital N name in the party, including some who said they were only backing him because he was so far ahead that nobody else had a chance. Which was just as well, they said, because it was very important to get the party machinery into high gear early on behind a consensus candidate. And Ed Muskie, they all agreed, was the only Democrat that could beat Nixon in November. And they were just riling everybody up with, get your people behind Muskie, or risk crippling the party with another of those goddamn protest movements that will end up like all others and not accomplish anything except to guarantee Nixon's reelection. It doesn't change. They weren't really voting for somebody, they were voting against somebody, and I'm sure we heard the rhetoric about how it was the most important election of their lifetime. So, to sum up, in Florida, George Wallace got 42% in a field of 11 contenders. Muskie, who was supposed to be the national front runner, finished fourth with only 9%. And then it says, and then he went on all the TV networks to snarl, that's another great word, about how this horrible thing would never have happened except that Wallace is a beast and a bigot. And Hunter says that is at least half true, but it doesn't have much to do with why Muskie got beaten like a gong in Florida. And Hunter actually worried that when the Muskie dream came crashing down that the candidate was capable of violence, and he was going to make sure he was far away from any of those scenes. And he said, it's becoming increasingly impossible, for instance, that Hubert Humphrey will be the Democratic presidential nominee this year and cause another Nixon-Humphrey campaign. And he said he would prefer no election at all rather than that nightmare. He said another Nixon-Humphrey horror would almost certainly cause a fourth party uprising. Now, I'm not even sure what that means. Who would be the third party he was thinking of? I don't know. It's a strange turn of phrase that I don't understand. And guarantee Nixon's re-election. If the Democratic Party nominates Humphrey again in 72, the party will get exactly what it deserves. They nominate shitty people all the time, both of them, and they never seem to get what they deserve. All right, that's it for later in March. So our next chapter is April, in which they'll be talking about the primaries in Wisconsin, and it is a long chapter. This was one of the big ones, if I remember correctly. Let's see, 119 to 163, so over 40 pages. And most of them were around 20 pages, so that's why I found that a bit surprising. But the next one is 30, so he mixed it up. All right. I will see you guys once I finish that one.